Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. It's Tasa. And today, reputation and integrity have become two of the most valuable and least understood currencies in the investment migration industry. Today, we're unpacking the gap between what looks clean on paper and what holds up under real scrutiny. Joining us is Michael Watt, who is the Regional Managing Director at Kroll. Welcome, Michael. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Tassan. How are you?
I am wonderful. I'm glad you can join us. So let's start with an introduction. For listeners who may not be familiar with you and your firm, how would you describe your role within the investment migration space?
First, Tassan, I want to say thanks for the invitation for this podcast. I know that there's been a number of really interesting episodes recently ahead of CIS 26, so I'm looking forward to digging into these details. And also, maybe to answer your question to start, I am a leader in Kroll's Investigations, Diligence, and Compliance group in the Americas. I'm based in Miami, and my role sits at the intersection of due diligence, reputation risk, and government decision making. And where we fit in the investment migration space is that we've worked with Caribbean governments for many years, not just on citizenship by investment due diligence, but also on financial investigations, fraud matters, and complex enforcement and integrity issues. That background is important because it means that we come into the CBI space with a very clear understanding of how risks actually materialize for governments, whether it be financially, politically, or reputationally, namely when things go wrong. So, in practical terms, my work focuses on supporting citizenship by investment units with independent, risk based due diligence on applicants, often in higher risk or more ambiguous cases. And our perspective that we share in that work is shaped by the investigations we've conducted well beyond the application file. So, when approvals are questioned later, when assets need to be traced, or when governments are under external scrutiny. So, what we bring to the CBI space isn't just compliance expertise, it's an investigative mindset that we use to translate local nuance. And we've seen what second order risk looks like after the fact, and that experience helps governments ask tougher questions up front and make decisions that hold up not just legally but reputationally over time.
Well, with the way the industry is going right now, we're under scrutiny all the time. So we appreciate company like yours.
Of course.
So, drawing from your professional experience, if you had to assess the current global perception of Caribbean citizenship by investment programs, how would you characterize it? Is it misunderstood, scrutinized, or evolving?
So I know this is a big question, and I know this is going to be a major topic for the conference itself. And I'd say the global perception of Caribbean citizenship by investment programs is a mix of misunderstood, heavily scrutinized, and only gradually catching up with reality. And that tension sits at the heart of this reputation issue or this perception issue. On the one hand, a lot of people are still looking at these programs through an outdated lens that they're overly transactional or lightly governed. That storyline or that narrative has really stuck early on, and it's been difficult to shake even though the day to day reality has changed significantly. At the same time, the scrutiny is intense and often disproportionate. These programs are expected to function like immigration authorities, compliance teams, financial intelligence units, and reputation managers all at once with essentially zero room for error. And what's interesting is that we're starting to see a shift. More sophisticated shareholders, banks, visa waiver partners, regulators are beginning to recognize that in many cases, these are now some of the most tightly screened pathways to citizenship anywhere in the world. But the evolution isn't even. So perception always lags reality in this space, and trust is still driven by outcomes, not effort. Until programs are judged not just on whether they follow the rules, but on how they handle gray area cases and when they're willing to say no, that perception gap is going to persist.
100% agree with everything you just said, and that's so true. Do you believe Caribbean CIPs are operating in what might call a trust deficit environment? If so, what created it and what sustains it?
Another challenging question, but I would say the short answer is yes. Caribbean CIPs are operating in what I'd call more of a trust constrained environment. But the
Okay.
important thing is to be clear where that trust deficit actually sits and why it's still there, to the second part of your question. So, starting with what created it, it wasn't one big scandal or one bad program, it built up over time. So, early on, when the space was smaller and scrutiny was lighter, some program design choices created a perception that stuck, even though standards have since moved on and developed quite a bit. So, you then had some isolated failures that I know everyone in this space is very familiar with. Often a very small number of approvals that ended up defining a narrative far beyond their actual scale. So, in other words, some very isolated problems that became a much bigger narrative driver. Because reputation in this space is extremely asymmetric or unbalanced. One controversial case can outweigh hundreds of very solid decisions. And on top of that, a lot of external stakeholders, whether they be NGOs, media, or even supranational bodies, they tend to assess these programs through a more political or moral lens, not entirely an operational one. So that means nuance oftentimes gets lost, and due diligence and due diligence programs are judged almost entirely by outcomes and not how decisions are actually made in practice. And finally, there's of course this unavoidable reality for governments. They can't publicly explain why specific applications are approved or rejected. That silence or that confidentiality, as necessary as it is, it creates a space for speculation, even when systems are doing exactly what they're supposed to, what they're designed to. And then that's what essentially sustains the trust gap today. Or in other words, all it takes is one very vocal applicant that receives a denial that can more publicly announce their dissatisfaction or maybe make claims against a specific nation's program that may not necessarily be true. But at this point, the issue is not weak due diligence. It's that trust has to be constantly re-earned in this environment where skepticism is the default. This is international skepticism, of course. Those expectations, they also just keep rising. That CIPs are increasingly judged against standards that are closer to banks or sanctions authorities, even though they operate in very different mandates. Public perception is also lagging reality because controls have evolved faster than this narrative around them. There's also what I would call second order risk. So even decisions that are legally sound can create reputational exposure later. This can either be through, again, media scrutiny or leaks or political shifts, either months or years down the line,
Right.
that keeps trust really fragile. So I'd actually reframe this a bit. I don't actually see that there's a trust deficit caused by negligence. I see that it's a trust stress test environment where trust is constantly being challenged by various factors. And these programs are operating under unusually intense scrutiny due to a whole host of publicized factors where their margin for error is close to zero because outcomes matter more than process and judgment matters as much as compliance. That's why the conversation has shifted. In this space, it's no longer are programs compliant? It's can programs demonstrate judgment, restraint, escalation when the risk isn't necessarily black and white? And that's really the point.
That is really interesting. You brought up the fact of the that they cannot comment and they cannot um, because of the information that we have privy to. The countries can't make certain comments or claims um, based on privacy issues. This also happens on a local sense. Locally, the CBI programs are lacking from, transparency, but they cannot be, as transparent as they might need to be. So I think that is, from a PR perspective, is something that everyone will need to address and can be discussed at CIS 26.
Of course, I agree. And I think that the key thing on the transparency point and how it relates to PR, it's not only walking the walk, but it's talking the talk too. There's nothing wrong with explaining, and I think it's actually really important to explain the guidelines and the mandates and how these programs are viewing the future or even current risks, and the particularly the new regulatory environment. There's an aspect that I know is very key and important that we're going to be talking about at the conference, where sharing best practices and communicating oftentimes with one voice as a region is really crucial for setting the tone, and because ultimately collectively we're much stronger as one voice rather than 5 or 6 disparate voices.
Agreed. I completely agree. And I look forward to those discussions. So, a standard background check focuses on verifying identity and uncovering risk. Where does the reputational lens go further, and why is it critical in today's investment migration landscape?
So this is very much a hot topic, I realize, because a standard background check and what many in the industry see as a standard background check, it's really about verification, as you said. So confirming identity, checking databases, seeing whether someone's on a sanctions list or they have criminal records or they're on a watch list. That's necessary and essential, but it's really only the starting point, because the reputational lens goes further by asking a different question, and that question is, how could a decision play out later, even if everything looks technically clean today? It looks at patterns, contexts, associations, and behavior, things that don't always show up as red flags or on a watch list, but can create exposure down the line. That's how, well, sorry, that includes how wealth is built, who someone is connected to, how they're perceived locally, and really whether there's a track record that suggests future scrutiny rather than past wrongdoing. In today's investment migration landscape, that's very critical, because programs aren't just judged at the moment of approval, they're judged years later by banks, visa waiver partners, regulators, and again, the media and NGOs. Reputational risk, it tends to surface before that legal or regulatory risk, and once it does, it's very hard to contain, as I've said. That something that we've seen repeatedly through the investigations conducted on behalf of governments after the fact is that these early stage issues end up leading to much larger downstream problems for the institutions, because the reputational lens is not about decision quality. It is about decision quality, not just compliance, and it helps answer the harder question: even if we approve this application, should we? And in an environment where there's zero room for error, that judgment call matters as much as any database hit.
Okay, and I can understand that. So let's shift the conversation a little bit to when clean on paper isn't clean in practice. Let's talk more about reputational risk in the context of Caribbean investment migration programs. How is it defined, and why is it more consequential than purely legal or compliance risk?
So when we talk about reputational risk, at least in the context of Caribbean investment migration programs, we're really talking about how decisions age over time and how they're judged by outsiders. It's not just whether they're defensible at the moment when they were made. Reputational risk is murkier than legal or compliance risk, because it doesn't live in rules or databases. It lives in external perception, context, and narrative, and it's shaped by how banks, visa waiver partners, regulators, media, and other external parties, how they interpret a decision that may become public later, often after the fact and without the full context governments had at the time of approval. That's really the challenge that these CIUs have, because once that perception hardens, it's very hard to unwind. We can see this really play out in a few clear patterns across the region. One is what I view as aggregate scrutiny, or just scrutiny that's built up, especially around visa-free access. I know this is, again, another hot topic of discussion for many of these programs that we'll discuss in during the conference, but in parts of Europe, we've seen concern shift away from individual problem cases to the general category itself. Is that a lot of these European governments are beginning to be a little more vocal about their doubts about these visa-free access programs, because even as Caribbean programs strengthen due diligence enforcement, the discussion increasingly focused on either approval volumes, rejection rates, and broader program design concerns at scale. And that's reputational risk showing up at a macro level where consequences like pressure on visa-free travel emerge without a single decision being formally ruled wrong. Another pattern is really how integrity measures themselves can generate reputational risk, kind of similar to the issue around transparency and confidentiality. Things like, against either sudden revocations or agent crackdowns or policy shifts, they may be necessary to protect a program, but if they appear abrupt or opaque or poorly communicated, they can trigger significant external reaction. We've seen this with many of the current events in the news today, that there can be an upswelling of dissatisfaction when a population is suddenly without economic citizenship. That reputation question, in that kind of situation, it becomes less about the substance of the action and more about how it's perceived internationally, either by investors, banks, partner governments watching closely. Because even if, say, the decision to change policy, even if it's made less effectively, it could still be accepted well, because of various agreements or international consensus around certain topics. But it's more about ensuring that each time you're communicating these sorts of decisions, that you're taking an equitable and proportionate approach when speaking to the public. That often, I think this situation though, or that this general theme, it really shows why reputation risk tends to be more consequential in investment migrations, because these programs, they operate in a high trust environment with very little room for error, like I've said, because one decision that doesn't stand up under second guessing can have these outsized consequences. And that's why the reputational lens matters so much in due diligence. It's not just about, again, can we approve this application? It's really asking a harder question of, can we be comfortable defending this decision a year from now or maybe 5 years from now when the context may be very different?
So the question, do you think the CBI program as a whole generally gets blamed for any current changes to the visa-free access in certain countries? We all know that St. Lucia recently lost their visa-free access to the UK, and it's the assumption the CBI program is at fault for this, when that might not be the case. Do you think the CBI is blamed for these kind of changes?
So whether or not I believe they should be blamed, I think is a different question of, are they
Okay.
blamed? I think that yes, they have been blamed for revocations of visa-free access like this. But again, whether or not that's fair, there's oftentimes a number of diplomatic sensitivities that are not being fully discussed in public, not only by governments in the Caribbean, but also these other governments, so say like the UK or others in Europe, where the relationships between these governments, why they might sometimes seem strong in appearance, that there can be other discussions that are not fully properly publicized. But that's certainly a very challenging and I know a very sensitive question that's very important for the health and long-term stability of these programs.
Agreed. So in the industry, we often use the term clean on paper. In today's hyper-connected regulatory environment, does the term still hold weight, or has the baseline for successful application fundamentals shifted?
Sure. So well, at least from my perspective, I think clean on paper does have meaning, but it no longer is the equivalent of what a successful application looks like, because historically that phrase was more shorthand for something very specific, and again, for our audience, it's that these documents, they checked out, the databases came back clear, the source of funds looked plausible or reasonable, and nothing triggered a formal red flag. In a less connected world, or a world where these programs are under less scrutiny, that was often sufficient. But what really changed is the baseline of that scrutiny and not the relevance of paperwork. So the paperwork, again, still important, but in today's environment, approvals don't just stay confined to an application file. They really live on across jurisdictions, across institutions, and in public narratives that governments ultimately don't control. This is much more important for how international banks perceive these programs and how they're reviewing economic citizens for, say, bank accounts or transactions outside of the Caribbean. Because banks, they can rescreen these passport holders years later and have a whole host of different concerns that were not really raised or apparent at the time of that economic citizenship being granted by one of these programs. The same sort of phenomenon similarly happens anytime journalists maybe they re-examine or look at an economic citizen after a major political event, where they, again, when that economic citizenship is granted, that political event or that geopolitical event has not occurred yet, and it may still raise scrutiny on that program for a certain individual that might be controversial to have a passport like that. But I think that the real shift has become more anticipatory rather than retrospective. That the question isn't just whether there's adverse information or negative news today, but whether the profile of an applicant can withstand future scrutiny in a very different context, because we know we're in a fast-moving world and there's change that's happening constantly on a day-by-day basis. And this really includes how resilient an applicant's story is and whether their affiliations or their connections, they invite attention, and whether approving them introduces questions that are difficult to answer later, even if, again, no rules were broken. So one way I think about this is that the industry moved from document sufficiency to more decision durability. That's where I see the more robust programs move in the direction of, and that's what I think some of the more recent regulatory changes in the last year that I know we'll talk a little bit more, maybe we'll want to talk a little bit more about later, where it's been driving some of this improved level of compliance, is the long-term durability that's been established by some of these regulations. So again, the clean on paper phenomenon hasn't disappeared, but I think it's been more demoted by long-running or future expectation of reputational risk. And this clean on paper phenomenon, it's not really it's more of the floor or the baseline and not the finish line where the programs want to be.
Well, you've touched on my next question. An approval might be legally defensible today, but will it be reputationally survivable 5 years from now when international standards shift again? How can CBI units future-proof their decision?
So future proofing is, well, I do think that this is the right way to frame it, or at least your question is the right way to frame it, because in this space, the real risk isn't usually about whether an approval is defensible today. Again, it's whether it still holds up when the context changes. I think the key thing to forget about when we're in such a highly volatile environment is that international standards or political changes, they will happen again, or they will shift. Those international standards will shift again. They always do. I see it more as a long-term evolution, or at least ideally, it's more of an evolution rather than a more chaotic shift in different directions. We haven't really seen that really with any of these programs. It's more just a long-term evolution. But what tends to cause trouble is assuming that meeting today's rules, that it automatically generates longer-term comfort. But in reality, reputational survivability, it depends on how well a decision can be understood, explained, and defended under future scrutiny. Because if, say, there's different regulators, or maybe there's an uptick in, or there's a change in how international banks are viewing these economic citizens, it's important to look ahead and understand that the strongest programs have made a more quiet shift from this, what I view as rules-based comfort, to decision resilience.
Decision resilience. Can you explain that further?
So, as in decisions that can stand the test of time.
Okay.
So, what that means is, and how I think about evidencing that, when you're thinking about a future problem that, maybe to use an example of, say, you are the program itself, you're the Citizenship by Investment unit, and you're being asked from an international regulator, why did you, as the compliance officer, the risk officer, why did you make the decision? That you want to be able to point to a few things, that you documented your judgment, your decision, and not just the outcomes. That judgment is very important, because even when a case or an applicant that they're clean on paper, that there may be contextually sensitive details, or there might be it might be important to record at the time of that decision what was considered and what was weighed and what factors mattered. That creates over time this institutional memory for your unit, and that's again important for answering that question when decisions are later scrutinized.
CIS 26 is in St. Lucia this year.
Yes.
Actually, less than a month away. As a platinum partner at CIS 26, Kroll is also leading a specialized workshop designed to do deeper than the main stage discussions. When delegates step into your sessions, what distinct insights, real-world applications, or behind-the-scenes perspectives can they expect, particularly around due diligence, risk, and reputational integrity?
So I appreciate you asking, Tessa. One of the sessions that I'm really excited about us hosting is that we're going to be doing a workshop to, like you asked, to take the conversation out of the abstract. We expect more abstract views and policies to be discussed, in the main panels, but the workshops are going to be more of an opportunity to dive really into the decision space, where CIUs and how CIUs and advisors and policymakers, how they actually operate. And our session is built around the idea of reputation laundering in the disinformation age. This is a topic that I haven't really mentioned yet on this podcast, but it's a growing challenge that many CIUs are having to face on the applicant level, where the reality is that today that risk isn't just about what you find in an applicant's profile or background, but it's what's missing or sometimes obscured or hidden, or what's strategically deprioritized. So I'll give you an example. If you're a high net worth individual that has exposure in a lot of industries and you're a highly publicized individual, there can be a whole host of very negative news from either your competitors or maybe people that just generally don't like you for different reasons. And you can pay either search aggregators or PR firms to delist or derank some of those search results, those news media results. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But it can lead to a lot of questions from a CIU perspective on, okay, what do I do with this phenomenon? And what are the common ways to think about a very high profile person that has, you would think, significant amount of scrutiny? Are there ways for us to detect active reputation management practices where what you can see on paper, again, may not necessarily be reflective of how something works in practice? I think that hearing from everyone at the conference that has that kind of experience with dealing with those sorts of problems, and having a more interactive and facilitated discussion, it can be, I think, really useful for all of us. I think, even myself included, hearing about how the steps that people take to decide on applicants that kind of face this sort of situation. At least from my experience, the Kroll team and I will We'll be sharing that experience on what we've seen different international banks, how they viewed these sorts of situations, and how they interpret this from a client onboarding perspective in a different way than how that would apply for economic citizens.
It's interesting to discuss the fact that, we earlier we said clean on paper. Forget that. If you're clean on social media, if you're clean in the media, if you're too clean, but that wealthy or that popular, or your company is that big, that's a is that a red flag?
I don't think it should be, but it's worth wondering. If someone is a very if they're a celebrity, right?
Sure.
Every celebrity, every high net worth individual, there is always either some direct or indirect connection to some sort of controversy. And again, there's nothing wrong with this practice, but
Okay.
it is important to know that this practice exists and how to think about ways to interpret the phenomenon.
Correct. Digging deeper, which is what Kroll has to do. What is one of the actionable shifts the governments or authorized agents could implement immediately post CIS 26 to strengthen the program brand and resilience?
So I think one of the big shifts from what I've heard from the CIUs in the last year is the adoption of biometrics. And if I had to pick one immediate shift that I hope that we're going to see after CIS 26 is that these biometrics programs that they've been both audited and stress tested, that hopefully they've been in practice and they've been adopted and they've been tested over the last year or so, and hopefully very quickly they are defensible and they can say or be explained to international regulators or even international banks and be explained and justified and demonstrated that they are working as expected, and that the programs they're able to answer some really hard questions like how are false positives and false negatives handled. So what that means kind of for the audience that are not close to biometrics is that when you have say when you go to the airport, when you have your face scanned before you board a plane, there's a whole lot of thinking, sometimes it's AI related, about tracing your biometric information to information that is available in a database, and sometimes that can lead to some difficult false positives where the camera or the biometric program thinks that you are someone that you are not. And conversely, from a programmer's perspective, how do you make sure that you don't miss something because of the general challenges around, say, using AI when you're being processed through this biometric system with the concept known as deepfakes? I don't think that this necessarily requires new legislation to do the audit and stress testing of some of these programs. But they can, at the CIU level, they can start with independent testing and scenario reviews and documenting their escalation protocols and making sure that that they're as robust as what they're expected to be. The reason why this matters is really simple because the external confidence on these programs and now hinges on credibility and not intent, like I mentioned before. So if I had to think about this from a more practical way after the CIS conference, that hopefully the participants can say not just that yes we use biometrics, but they're able to show how well they work and what happens when they don't work.
And this is where Kroll's expertise comes into play.
Yes, that's right. It's always very challenging, of course, anytime these programs are adopting these new biometrics programs providers, and oftentimes they're looking for these sorts of external assessments on how they're working in practice and all the things that I mentioned in terms of the stress testing aspects that sometimes the CIUs might not be equipped if they don't have significant experience with biometrics.
Agreed. So, with regional regulatory bodies like ECCIRA gaining momentum, do you see the Caribbean becoming the global benchmark for intelligence led vetting by the end of 2026?
Um, I think the honest answer is that there's definitely the potential to become the global benchmark. But I think progress, again, we're kind of a year on now from ECCIRA, and that progress is early, and continued progress from those efforts can't be guaranteed into the future. But there's no question that ECCIRA is a meaningful step forward. From a program or from an external perspective, the creation of a regional regulator with shared standards and centralized registries and sharp coordination is exactly the kind of architecture international partners have been calling for the last several years. And what's, I think, unique about this is that very few regions offering investment migration have moved this decisively towards collective governance rather than internal competition within the region. That said, the view I shared earlier about future-proofing reputational risk, it really applies here too, because it's about how consistently and rigorously the ECCIRA guidelines are applied in practice. I also think it's a timing issue, right? That by the end of 2026, it's still going to be a relatively young regulatory mechanism, and we'll have to wait and see how the system actually behaves in edge cases. Say how is it going to respond when there is a significant issue or problem that is found at some later date. But I think one of the again, just looking ahead to the conference itself, one of the panels that I'm most looking forward to is maybe hearing this question answered from all the CIU heads, and how do they think, what do they need to do, what are they doing to become the global benchmark for investment migration. That's something I'm really looking forward to. But again, my view is cautiously optimistic. I think we're moving faster in the region, and more collectively than any other region, like I've said. But that movement and that ambition matters a lot less than what discipline looks like on the execution side. And I'm really interested in hearing about that, discussed and debated more at CIS.
Not only will the CEOs or the heads of the programs be there, but as well as the prime ministers for
That's
these.
right.
Exactly. So it will be nice to see this conversation go further. Looking into the future, as we see more AI driven screening tools, how do we ensure that human judgment and contextual intelligence, the core of Kroll's work, aren't lost in the drive for efficiency?
So this is, I know it's been a theme for several years, and it's becoming more and more common when we're thinking and talking about due diligence. And in large part, it's becoming such a hot topic because AI is moving so quickly that in some places, um, the AI development is outpacing the governance around it, or sometimes there's very limited governance, and sometimes it's not regulated at all. But the way I think about this is that we don't protect human judgment by resisting AI. We protect it by putting AI in the right position in the decision chain. So from a due diligence perspective, um, regulators and standard setters are very aligned on this, that AI doesn't replace accountability, that responsibility sits with people and not systems. So how that translates in practice is that AI is still being leveraged for pattern recognition, for reviewing and surfacing information from large sets of data. But that sort of practice of using AI, it can't necessarily tell you whether a source is credible and whether it's politically motivated. This kind of goes to the theme of the reputation laundering phenomenon in the industry, or reputation management phenomenon. If you ask AI, are there red flags about someone? Often, and there are not. The output oftentimes is not going to have the context that you would have without a human due diligence analyst, or even on the CIU side, the CIU making these sorts of risk-based, forward-thinking decisions on an application that you can expect an AI to be able to help out with today. This is at least how we approach it at Kroll, that AI, again, it helps focus attention and reduce noise. But again, that decision is ultimately still with humans and making sure that your governance is in place. This is something that I know firms like Kroll have been thinking about and focusing on for a long time, that when AI becomes much more ubiquitous, it feels like it's already very common today, but when it becomes more ubiquitous, that the governance and the policies are in place, that we all know how to use it, and we go through the trainings, and we stick to the policy. That is really important for not only how firms like Kroll are thinking about it, but also how CIUs are using and thinking about AI too.
That's so true. Do you see any new institutional relationships, whether with U.S. wealth managers, multilateral bodies, or compliance networks, defining the next phase of credible investment migration?
So this is a good question. Maybe just continuing the AI example. There are a whole host of, like I mentioned, international regulators and standard setting bodies that are working together to help define what governance should look like for the use of AI in due diligence or in citizenship by investment. And at least on the topic of new institutional relationships, though, I do know that this U.S. convergence, as I think you like to say it, Tasa, of being able to leverage and utilize the diverse backgrounds from the many different parties that are attending and participating in an event like CIS 26. It's going to be really important because oftentimes these, with just how like the size of the industry today, that being able to leverage connections with either, like you asked, multilateral bodies or international regulators, it's really important because I know that even with the construction of ECC IRA, it required input from a few different international regulators that had experience thinking about establishing a similar program and project, that without using some of the best practices from say programs that had challenges or maybe did things wrong, that's really the best accelerator for investment migration in the Caribbean.
I completely agree. I mean, it's a learning perspective that they have to discuss with not only the other regulatory bodies that exist, but learn from everyone and all. Since at CIS, there's going to be all different levels of participants there, this is the best place to start the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
If there's one reputational truth you want every delegate to take away from from your sessions at CIS 26, what would that be?
So great question. Maybe to kind of wrap things up a little bit, if I did have to leave delegates or this audience with one thing on the reputational side, is that reputation isn't built at the point of approval. It's tested long after the file is closed or long after the economic citizenship is granted to someone. Most programs and intermediaries, they do a lot of things right on the front end, and they again follow the rules, they apply frameworks, and they document compliance. But like I said before, where reputational risk really shows up is years later, when an approval is looked at through a different lens than what happened before. And the real question isn't did we comply, it's can we explain and defend this decision when the assumptions change. That's why I think that that CIS 26 and our sessions there will be focused less on checklists and more on decision durability, to use a phrase from before, and how judgment is applied and how ambiguity is handled and whether the reasoning behind a decision would make sense to an external audience, say 5 or 10 years from now. So again, if there's one takeaway, it's that every approval is a future reputational asset or liability, and the work doesn't end when citizenship is granted. It really starts there.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and we look forward to meeting you at CIS 26. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Likewise, Hassan, it's a pleasure speaking with you today, and I also look forward to meeting and seeing you at St. Lucia, and I know that'll be very soon, so I look forward to it.
Definitely. What we've learned is that reputation isn't just a safeguard, it's a strategy. Many thanks to you, Michael of Kroll, for helping us rethink how credibility is built, protected, and ultimately valued in today's investment migration landscape. So, to everyone out there, see you at CIS 26 in St. Lucia.